coverage of the impeachment of President Trump. Want to go straight to the House floor where the articles of impeachment against the president are being read.
Presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In so doing, President Trump used the powers of the presidency and that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into A, political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia, alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the president of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine, but has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. Article 2, Obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment, and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committees undertaking the investigation served subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Preston Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vogt, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbuhl. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives and the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Joe Novotny, the reading clerk of the House, reading the Articles of Impeachment.
Resolution 767. The amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Judiciary is adopted. The resolution shall be debatable for 6 hours, equally divided, and controlled by the chair and ranking member of the Committee on the Judiciary or their respective designees. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, each will control 3 hours. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on H.Res. 755.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished Speaker of the House.
Gentlelady, distinguished speakers recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, for his tremendous leadership.
I can't hear Pelosi. We can't hear her.
I'll be presiding later in the day. My colleagues, this morning and every morning, when we come together, members rise and pledge allegiance to the flag. Every day, all across America, children in school, members of the military, officials, and those civically engaged also pledge allegiance to the flag. Let us recall what that pledge says. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The republic for which it stands is what we are here to talk about today. A republic, if we can keep it. We gather today under the dome of this temple of democracy to exercise one of the most solemn powers that this body can take, the impeachment of the President of the United States. No member, regardless of party or politics, comes to Congress to impeach a president. But every one of us, as our first act as a member of Congress, stood on this historic House floor before our beautiful American flag and raised our hands in this sacred oath. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So help me God. For 230 years, members have taken that sacred oath, which makes us custodians of the Constitution. When our founders declared independence and established a new nation, they crafted a system of government unlike one ever seen before, a republic, starting with the sacred words, "We the people." For centuries, Americans have fought and died to defend democracy for the people. But very sadly now, our founders' vision of a republic is under threat from actions from the White House. That is why today, as Speaker of the House, I solemnly and sadly open the debate on the impeachment of the President of the United States. If we do not act now, we would be derelict in our duty. It is tragic that the President's reckless actions make impeachment necessary. He gave us no choice. What we are discussing today is the established fact that the President violated the Constitution. It is a matter of fact that the President is an ongoing threat to our national security and the integrity of our elections, the basis of our democracy. Hundreds of historians, legal scholars, and former prosecutors, regardless of party, have stated that the President committed impeachable offenses. Since today is a national civics lesson, though a sad one, I submit these documents for the record and commend them for students to study.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. What we are discussing today is the established fact that the President, again, violated the Constitution. It is a matter of fact that the President is, again, an ongoing threat to our national security. And the testimony of decorated war heroes, distinguished diplomats, and patriotic career public servants, some of the President's own appointees over the past weeks, have told us this. The President used the power of his public office to obtain an improper personal political benefit at the expense of America's national security. When a president weakens a Democratic ally that is advancing American security interests by fighting an American adversary, the president weakens America. This abuse of power also jeopardizes the integrity of our elections. All Americans agree that American voters should choose our president, not some foreign government. The founders understood that it is profoundly corrosive for our democracy for a president to invite interference in our elections. As George Washington, our nation's patriot, under whose gaze we stand today, warned, history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. George Washington. Sadly, the American people have witnessed further wrongs of the president, which necessitate the second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress. When the president's wrongdoing was revealed, he launched an unprecedented, indiscriminate, and categorical campaign of defiance and obstruction. Never before in the history of our nation have we seen a president declare and act if he is above the law. The president goes even so far as to say and act on this absurdity when he says, Article 2 says I can do whatever I want. No, it doesn't. That recklessness is a profound violation of the Constitution and our republic, which endure because of our system of separation of power, 3 co-equal branches, each a check and balance on the other, a republic, again, if we can keep it. The founders' great fear of a rogue or corrupt president is the very reason why they enshrined impeachment in the Constitution. As one founder, William Davey of North Carolina, warned, unless the Constitution contained an impeachment provision, a president might spare no efforts or means whatever to get himself reelected. Another founder, George Mason, insisted that the president who procured his appointment in the first instance through improper and corrupt acts might repeat his guilt and return to power. We in Congress, Article 1, the legislative branch, must stand up and make clear to the American people and to all people that this body still stands by the principles enshrined in the Constitution and defended by generations of Americans. Last week, in observance of the 75th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, members traveled to that hallowed ground to express our gratitude to the heroes of freedom who sacrificed everything to secure victory of freedom over tyranny, not just for America, but for the world. The veterans of that battle, who were there in their 90s, told us how after the war was won, the Europeans to whom they liberated would ask, "Why did you risk us? You don't know us, and give your lives to save us. We're not Americans." And our men would say, "We came here to fight for you, not because you are Americans, because we are Americans." As our beloved Chairman Elijah Cummings, an Oversight Committee Chair, our North Star, said when announcing his support for this action, quote, "When the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny." He also said, almost prophetically, "When we are dancing with the angels, the question will be, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact?" Elijah, as you know, has since passed on. Now he is dancing with the angels. And I know that he and all of us here are very proud of the moral courage of members who want to honor the vision of our founders for a republic, the sacrifice of our men and women in uniform to defend it, and the aspirations of our children to live freely within it. Today, we are here to defend democracy for the people. May God bless America. I yield back the balance of my time.
Extraordinary statement there from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. Calling the president an ongoing threat to national security, she says, "He gave us no choice. We must move to impeach." Mary Bruce, the House Speaker, has been driving this process from the moment she decided in September the inquiry should begin.
Georgia.
And George, as we have been saying all morning, this is something that the Speaker does not relish. This is not a move that she was looking forward to or even wanted to make. But as she made very clear there, she feels the president gave her no choice. And she has also been very adamant this is a somber day. She has said she's feeling sad today. This is not a political victory.
And now the ranking Republican on the House Judiciary Committee, Doug Collins.
No matter of what date they would schedule it. Nothing else. In fact, how it even began to look even further was on September 24th. The Speaker announced an impeachment inquiry before even seeing the call transcript that we're going to hear so much about today. You know, it's not about what this body can do and its constitutional oath. And there's been a lot of constitutional and founders thrown around and will be all day today. But there's one thing that I will mention all along, and that is also the founders were very concerned about a partisan impeachment in which politics of the majority who have their strength can do what they want to do irregardless of any facts. In fact, I've said it before and I will say it again. I do not believe, no matter what was said today and even what has been said, this is not a solemn occasion. When you go looking for something for 3 years, and especially this year since January, you ought to be excited when you found it, but they can't, because I know what is now happening. It took me last night, but I was thinking about it. Why do we keep calling this a solemn occasion when you've been wanting to do this ever since the gentleman was elected? Mr. President came forward and did what he saw fit for the American people, but yet they wanted to impeach him. And it hit me. Now I know. The reason they wanted to is now they're realizing what I told them and have been telling them for the last few weeks, that the clock and the calendar are terrible masters. The clock and the calendar are terrible masters. They do not care about anything except getting the time done and the calendar fixed. They do not care about facts. They do not care about time. And one day the clock and the calendar will hang along this body in a very detrimental way. How do I know this? Because one of our members, Ms. Tlaib, said on the night she was sworn in, we're going to impeach. Well, you know the rest. In May of 2019, Al Green said, I'm concerned if we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected. That is probably the most prescient thing said by the majority in the last year, is they said we can't beat him if we don't impeach him. There's a reason behind this impeachment. And even Speaker Pelosi said it would be dangerous to leave it to voters to determine whether President Trump stays in office. Really? After we just said the Pledge of Allegiance, we go back to the Speaker's own words and said it would be dangerous to leave it to the voters? I will tell you right now, Madam Speaker, we on the Republican side have no problem taking our case to the majority and to the people of this country because they elected Donald Trump, and it is a matter for the voters, not this House, not in this way, not in the way this is being done. It has trampled everything this House believes in. I said it yesterday, and I believe it to be this true today. I will fight this on process, which has been deplorable, to use a word of the majority. It has been awful. The calendar and the clock make it impressive that we actually do it quickly. We don't care about rules. We don't care about minority hearing days. We don't care about giving the opportunity for witnesses to be called because the chairman gets to determine what is relevant. Wow, that's pretty good. Let the accuser determine what is relevant to the one being accused. The people of America see through this. The people of America understand due process, and they understand when it is being trampled in the people's house. You see, it's also not a matter of process, which will be discussed today. It's a matter of actual facts. I will fight the facts all day long. Because what we found here today is a president who did not do as being charged. In fact, they had to go to abuse of power, this amorphous term that you're going to hear many, many arguments about how that abuse of power, except for one thing. The call itself, the two parties say no pressure. Nothing was ever done to get the money. In fact, they didn't even know the money was held. But there is something that very much bothers me about the facts. There were 5 meetings, we'll hear about those today, in which it was never a linkage made. There was one witness that is depended on over 600 times in the majority's report, that in the end, after questioned, had to say, well, that was my presumption of what was happening. You see, this is an impeachment based on presumption. This is an impeachment, basically also a poll-tested impeachment on what actually sells to the American people. Today's going to be a lot of things. What it is not is fair. What it is not is about the truth. What is true today, and I just heard it just a moment ago in the articles themselves where it said, and the speaker, I believe, actually talked about this as well, is that the president weakened a foreign leader. You know what the truth of the matter is? Madam Speaker, the most interesting and deplorable thing that I've heard over the last few weeks is the actual attack by the majority on President Zelensky. Because they realize their whole crux of their case is that if he was not pressured, their house of cards falls. And by the way, it's already failed. But if we can't show pressure, then we either have to call him a liar, a world leader, or we have to make up names to call him. And that's exactly what happened in the Judiciary Committee when a member of the majority actually said he's acting, or they're complaining to a battered wife. That is below the dignity of this body, to take a world leader and when he doesn't make your case for you, to belittle him, especially, as is going to be often said by the majority, that they're in the middle of a hot war with Russia. You see, President Trump actually did give them offensive weapons. President Trump did nothing wrong. We're going to talk about that all day long today. We went on process and we went on facts. Why? Because the American people will see through this. But before I close this first part, I will have to recognize that even the Senate, the minority leader in the Senate, recognizes that the House did not do their job because he can't make the case to his own members, so he's having to ask for witnesses, ask for more time. You see, and even yesterday, it was sort of funny. I thought it hilarious. The minority leader in the Senate went out and did a press conference and said, they denied my witnesses. They denied my request. Well, welcome to the club, Mr. Schumer. That's exactly what's happened over here for the last 3 months. Amen. So today, we're going to talk a lot about impeachment. We're going to talk a lot about a president, and we're going to talk about 2 articles of impeachment. Abuse of power, because they can't actually pin anything of factual basis on him. The president did nothing wrong in this issue. And then they're going to talk about obstruction of Congress. You know, obstruction of Congress, as I've said before, is like petulant children saying we didn't get our way when we didn't ask the right way and we didn't actually go after it and try to make a case. You know why, Madam Speaker? The clock and the calendar. are terrible masters, and the majority will own that problem today, because to the clock and the calendar, facts don't matter. The promises to the base matter, and today is a promise kept for the majority. Not a surprise, a fact. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, the House of Representatives must now consider 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump. The first article charges that the president used his public office
Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Gerald
foreign
Nadler.
government into attacking his political rival. The second article charges that the president took extreme and unprecedented steps to obstruct our investigation into his conduct. Taken together, the 2 articles charge that President Trump placed his private political interests above our national security, above our elections, and above our system of checks and balances. After months of investigation, there can be no serious debate about the evidence at hand. On July 25th, when he spoke to President Zelensky of Ukraine, President Trump had the upper hand. The president, through his agents, had already demanded that Ukraine announce an investigation of his political opponents. Ukraine needed our help, both military aid, which had been appropriated by Congress because of our security interests, and an Oval Office meeting to show the world that the United States continues to stand with Ukraine against Russian aggression. President Trump should have been focused on the interests of the American people on that call. Instead, he prioritized his private political interests. President Trump asked President Zelensky for a favor. He wanted Ukraine to announce 2 bogus investigations, one into former Vice President Biden, then his leading opponent in the 2020 election, and another to advance a conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, attacked our elections in 2016. Neither request was premised on any legitimate national security or foreign policy interest. One was intended to help President Trump conceal the truth about the 2016 election. The other was intended to help him gain an advantage in the 2020 election. After the call, President Trump ratcheted up the pressure. He deployed his private attorney and other agents, some acting far outside the regular channels of diplomacy, to make his desires clear. There would be no aid and no meeting until Ukraine announced the sham investigations. To our founding generation, abuse of power was a specific, well-defined offense. A president may not misuse the powers of the presidency to obtain an improper personal benefit. The evidence shows that President Trump did exactly that. For this alone, he should be impeached. But the first article also identifies 2 aggravating factors. When President Trump conditioned military aid on a personal favor, he harmed America's national security. And when he demanded that a foreign government target his domestic political rival, he took steps to corrupt our next election. To the founders, these offenses clearly merited removal from office. The president faces a second article of impeachment for his efforts to obstruct our investigation of his misconduct. The Constitution grants the sole power of impeachment to the House of Representatives. Within our system of checks and balances, the president may not decide for himself what constitutes a valid impeachment inquiry, nor may he ignore lawful subpoenas or direct others to do so. Many presidents, including President Trump, have asserted privileges and other objections to specific subpoenas. But only President Trump has ordered the categorical defiance of a congressional investigation, the automatic rejection of all subpoenas. The president is not above the law, and he should be impeached for this as well. Congress cannot wait for the next election to address this misconduct. President Trump has demonstrated a clear pattern of wrongdoing. This is not the first time he has solicited foreign interference in an election, has been exposed, and has attempted to obstruct the resulting investigation. We cannot rely on the next election as a remedy for presidential misconduct when the president threatens the very integrity of that election. He has shown us he will continue to put his selfish interests above the good of the country. We must act without delay. By his actions, President Trump has broken his oath of office. His conduct continues to undermine our Constitution and threaten our next election. His actions warrant his impeachment and demand his removal from office. I urge my colleagues to support these articles, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is my pleasure at this time to yield 3 minutes.
And to give you a sense of what's going to happen right now, the gentleman, the chairman and the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee now control the next 3 hours of time. They'll be allocating it to members of their party. We expect this to go on for about 2.5 to 3 hours.
Officer, including the president, may be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Unlike the Nixon and Clinton cases, there are no allegations that the president has committed a crime. We've had almost 3 years of nonstop investigations. We've had the Mueller report, we've had the Schiff investigation, we've had the Nadler investigation, and at no time is there any evidence that indicates that Donald J. Trump violated any criminal statute of the United States. So why are we here? We're here because the majority caucus, the Democratic caucus, has been hijacked by the radical left. They have wanted to reverse the course of the 2016 election ever since Donald J. Trump won that election. So let's look at these 2 phony articles of impeachment. First of all, abuse of power. The phone call in question had the president say, "Our country has been through a lot. I want you to do us a favor. Not me a favor, us a favor." And there he was referring to our country, the United States of America, not a personal political gain. He was not afraid to let this transcript go public, and he released the transcript almost immediately after the call. Now, the second article, impeachment, obstruction of Congress, it basically says that unless the president gives us everything we want and when we want it, then he's committed an impeachable offense. That's a bunch of bunk. The president has certain individual and privileges by virtue of his office. Whenever there's been a dispute between the executive and legislative branches heretofore, they've gone to court. And the Supreme Court a couple weeks ago said they would take jurisdiction over deciding whether the president had to comply with one subpoena relating to his tax returns. Now here, the Democrats have been bent to impeach the president of the United States before the court decides this. And this means that there's a rush job to do this. And why is there? Because they want to influence the 2020 elections. And they spent 3 years doing it. They spent millions of taxpayers' dollars, including the Mueller report, putting together this impeachment. And they also have had this Congress wrapped around impeachment and not doing their jobs until the dam broke this week. Stop this charade, vote no, and I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman from Wisconsin knows full well the president asserted no privileges here. He simply ordered complete defiance of the impeachment inquiry. I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Nadler, for your leadership as we navigate this challenging time, not just for our committee and Congress, but for our country. It's with profound sadness that I stand here today in support of these articles of impeachment. President Trump's behavior is exactly what our founders feared most. They knew that with the awesome power of the presidency came the risk of a president abusing that power for personal gain. They were particularly concerned about an executive who became entangled with foreign governments, corrupted our elections, or sought to avoid consequences for his own misconduct in office. That is why they included impeachment in the Constitution, to protect our republic. Our colleagues across the aisle have claimed that we're impeaching the president because we don't like him. But this moment is about more than disagreement with the president's policies or personality. Those issues belong in the voting booth. Our task here is not to judge the president himself. Instead, we must judge his conduct and whether his actions have undermined our Constitution. The President has committed the highest of high crimes under our Constitution. He used the highest office in our government and taxpayer dollars to pressure a foreign country to interfere in our elections. He undermined our national security. And when he got caught, he tried to cover it up, obstructing our investigation and refusing to produce subpoenaed documents and witnesses. A government where the President abuses his power is not of the people. A government where the President pressures a foreign country to undermine our elections is not by the people. And a government where the President puts his own interests before the country is not for the people. This isn't complicated. You know it, I know it, the American people know it. President Trump's wrongdoing and the urgent threat that his actions present to our next election and our democracy leaves us no principled alternative but to support these articles of impeachment. Our Constitution, our country, and our children depend upon it. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish, as the gentlelady just said, I wish they would examine the factual conduct, but I guess that's not going to happen. So at this point, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank the gentleman from Georgia. Mr. Speaker, the founders of this country warned us against a single-party impeachment because they feared it would bitterly and perhaps irreparably divide our nation. The truth is, in the 243 years of this republic, there has never been a single-party fraudulent impeachment process like the one being used today. Our Democrat colleagues have weaponized the impeachment provision of the Constitution to nullify the votes of 63 million Americans who elected President Donald J. Trump. This is not about a phone call or Ukraine or even his use of the executive privilege. You have to remember that 95 of the Democrats on this floor today voted to impeach Donald Trump before the July 25th phone call ever happened between President Trump and President Zelensky. And not only is this a single-party impeachment, it's also evidence-free. After all their Herculean efforts, they could only come up with 2 short articles of impeachment. On the first, the Democrats know there is zero direct evidence in this record of these proceedings to show that President Trump engaged in any abuse of power. As you'll hear today, their entire case is based on hearsay, speculation, and conjecture, and there's not a single fact witness that can provide testimony to support their baseless allegations. The Democrats' second claim is that President Trump obstructed Congress by simply doing what virtually every other president in the modern era has also done, and that is to assert, Mr. Chairman, a legitimate executive privilege which protects the separation of powers. And you know what? If they disagreed with that, the Democrats could and should have just simply gone a few blocks away to a federal court to get an expedited court order compelling the extra documents and information they requested. That's what's always been done in the past. But they didn't do that here because these Democrats don't have time for it. They are trying to meet their own arbitrary, completely reckless, and Machiavellian timeline to take down a president that they loathe. The real abuse of power here is on the part of the House Democrats. That they has feverishly produced and pursued this impeachment 20 times faster than the impeachment investigation of Bill Clinton. They've tried to reach their predetermined political outcome, and along the way, they've steamrolled over constitutionally guaranteed due process.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Sacrosanct House rules and the federal rules of civil procedure. This must fail.
The gentleman's time has expired.
This is a shameful day for the country. I yield back.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman knows that impeachment was put into the Constitution as a defense of the Republic in between elections. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this is a day of accountability and defending our democracy. The facts in front of us are clear. This president, Donald J. Trump, coerced a fragile foreign ally to investigate his political opponent and interfere in our elections. And he leveraged critically needed, congressionally approved military aid to Ukraine. The president's allies want to claim that he did this because he cared about corruption. But if President Trump truly cared about corruption, then he would have listened to the talking points that were prepared by the National Security Council on anti-corruption. He did not. In fact, on those 2 calls with President Zelensky, he never mentioned the word corruption. He did not abide by the Department of Defense's own recommendation that Ukraine had passed all the anti-corruption benchmarks, and he didn't listen to the unanimous conclusion of all of his top advisors that he must release that aid to Ukraine. He did release the aid in 2017 and 2018, but not in 2019. Why? Because in 2019, Vice President Joe Biden was running for president. Because this is not hearsay. We have a responsibility. The president told us himself on national television exactly what he wanted from the phone call with President Zelensky. He came onto the White House lawn and he said, I wanted President Zelensky to open an investigation into the Bidens. He solicited foreign interference before. He is doing it now, and he will do it again. The president is the smoking gun. Our founders, Mr. Speaker, entrusted us with the awesome responsibility of protecting our democracy, which gets its power not from the bloodlines of monarchs, but from the votes of we the people. Without that, we are no longer a democracy, we are a monarchy or a dictatorship. And so today, to uphold my oath to Constitution and country, I will vote to impeach Donald J. Trump. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll also remind my chairman that impeachment was never been as a political weapon in between elections when you can't win the next one. And with that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Conaway.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Other than authorizing an act of war, impeachment is the gravest item that we as Congress can consider. The decision to move forward with impeachment of a United States president is so consequential that it's only been done 3 times previously in our nation's history, all based on legitimate evidence of criminal behavior. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues have diminished what should be a solemn and grave proceeding into an absolute political circus, simply because they don't like the man occupying the White House. Many Democrats have been intent on impeaching the president since the day he took office. Their actions are clearly motivated by hatred for President Trump. This impeachment vote today is the next step in their long-held plan to remove him from office. The partisan impeachment investigation run by the House Intelligence Committee was unnecessarily held behind closed doors in a room designed to share classified information. Nothing classified was shared during these meetings, but the result of this decision was that most members of Congress and all Americans were blocked from hearing the facts for themselves. Chairman Schiff repeatedly withheld crucial information from the Republicans, including the ability for anyone but himself and his staff to speak with the whistleblower at the center of the investigation. He was even called out by liberal media outlets for spreading misinformation and falsehoods throughout the impeachment process. The public hearings were complete disregard for the House rules and the decades of precedent. Republicans were not allowed to call witnesses or to make basic parliamentary motions. In fact, the only witnesses allowed to testify publicly were those who fit neatly within the Democrats' predetermined narrative. Most importantly, we have not been presented any real evidence that proves the president is guilty of high crimes and misdemeanors as required by the Constitution to remove a duly elected president. If there were criminal activity, as many of my Democrat colleagues claim, then why are there no crimes listed in the Articles of Impeachment? We are forever weakening this body by turning impeachment into a political weapon. This impeachment scheme is nothing more than an attempt to conduct a taxpayer-funded opposition research and damage the president's electability heading into 2020. The American people see right through this charade and are fed up. It's time for this madness to stop and for us to get back to the important work the American people sent us here to do. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for your leadership. Let's start by making this very simple. No one in America could do what Donald Trump did and get away with it. No American elected official can call up a foreign government and ask for an investigation of a political opponent. No member of Congress can call up a foreign official and ask for help in our re-election campaign. If we did that, we would likely get indicted. No one is above the law, and the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. I first swore an oath to the Constitution when I joined the United States Air Force on active duty. And the oath I took was not to a political party or to a president or to a king. It was to a document that has made America the greatest nation on earth. And that document contains a safeguard for when the president's abuse of power is so extreme that it warrants impeachment. We're not here because of policy disputes. While I disagree with the president, I acknowledge he has a right to restrict the number of refugees entering our country. He has a right to eliminate environmental executive orders. He has a right to sign a bill that has given tax breaks to the wealthy. But the president does not have the right to cheat and to solicit foreign interference in our elections. That is illegal. It is not what the voters elected him to do, and we will not stand for it. The president's actions in this case were particularly insidious because he also used our government for his private gain. He conditioned taxpayer-funded military aid and a critical White House meeting with the Ukrainian president on the requirement that Ukraine publicly announce an investigation into his opponent. And by harming Ukrainian national security, the president also harmed U.S. national security. And then the president solicited foreign interference again on the South Lawn of the White House, when he again asked Ukraine to investigate his political opponent, and then he asked China, our peer competitor, to do the same. That abuse of power is not acceptable. Whether or not the Senate convicts, the House has an independent duty to do the right thing. That's why we've passed over 275 bipartisan bills that are stuck in the Senate. Whether impeaching or legislating, we will continue to be faithful to the Constitution regardless of what the Senate may or may not do. Moreover, impeachment is a form of deterrence. Our children are watching. No president ever wants to be impeached. And whether Donald Trump leaves in 1 month, 1 year, or 5 years, this impeachment is permanent. It will follow him around for the rest of his life, and history books will record it. And the people will know why we impeached. It's all very simple. No one's above the law, not our commander-in-chief, not our president. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it's my pleasure to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank my colleague. In 2016, 63 million Americans went to the polls and elected Donald Trump president of the United States. House Democrats have been trying to overturn the election ever since. In fact, they've tried 5 additional times to the one that's before us to impeach the president, including the vote in May of 2017, just 5 months into his term. In January of this year, House Democrats took control of this chamber, and they're faced with a choice. They could use the tools of the majority to pursue legitimate priorities of the American people, policies that can impact their lives, or they could use the tools to undo the 2016 election. They made their choice. Since then, House Democrats have issued more subpoenas than bills have been signed into law. That tells us all we need to know about this Congress and that party. Rather than launch a legitimate investigation, Democrats turned to focus groups to workshop their language, to see if they could sell this to the American people. And the American people have rejected it. Instead of negotiating with the executive branch, for instance, and allowing the courts to resolve any legitimate disputes, House Democrats rushed an impeachment vote. So here we are, 12 weeks later, voting whether to impeach the president based off the thinnest record in modern history. It's no surprise that the Senate is already asking for additional witnesses and more documents and real evidence. The body of evidence is weak and woefully insufficient for impeachment. And with that, I yield back on this sad day for this institution.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Raskin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. American elections belong to the American people, not the American president and not foreign powers. No president may cheat the people by working with foreign governments to steal from us a free and fair election. And no president who attempts it may cover up that cheating by systematically obstructing Congress in our work. Article 2 of the Constitution does not authorize a president to do whatever he wants. The reason we have a Constitution is to keep government officials from doing whatever they want. If we, the people, lose the certainty of free and fair elections to presidential corruption and foreign manipulation, then we lose our democracy itself. the most precious inheritance we have received from prior generations that pledged their sacred honor and gave everything they had to defend it. The struggle for democracy is the meaning of America. That is why we remain the last best hope of a world ravaged by authoritarianism, violence, and corruption. We must act now to protect our elections and safeguard constitutional democracy for the enormous and unprecedented challenges that still lie ahead of us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition of H.R. 755. Today is a disappointing day. It is the day my colleagues from across the aisle cast the vote that they have spent the last 3 years obsessing over. The vote to impeach our duly elected president. There are 2 charges claimed by House Democrats, and there is 0 cause for either. While President Trump has led, our country has thrived, and Washington liberals have failed. Despite the commitment of many of our colleagues to obstruct the Trump administration's agenda at every turn, our country continues to succeed. In this body, however, we have not been able to deliver on what Americans want and need. We still have not finished securing our border. The opioid epidemic still rages in our communities. Our infrastructure is still in dire need of an overhaul, and we still have not reached a bipartisan resolution on drug pricing. If Congress hadn't spent the last year stuck in a divisive, ugly, partisan impeachment debacle, think of what we could have done. The lives that could have been saved, the communities that could have been improved, the crisis on our southern border ended, and the positive work that we should do for our country. But we didn't, all because of divisive political theatrics. Congress can do better than this, and America deserves better. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back, and the gentleman from Georgia reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the Articles of Impeachment against Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. Mr. Speaker, no one runs for Congress to impeach a president, but this president has left us no choice. President Trump abused the enormous powers of his office when he solicited foreign interference for the purpose of helping him in his re-election campaign in 2020. The president betrayed our national security and undermined the security of our elections when he put his own personal political interests ahead of the interests of our country. He tried to cheat to win re-election. And this wasn't an attack on Vice President Biden. This was an attack on our democracy. And if we do not hold the president accountable today, we will no longer live in a democracy. We will live in a dictatorship where any future president will be free to abuse their office in order to get reelected. So today, every member of this chamber faces a choice, whether to do what the Constitution demands and the evidence requires, or to turn a blind eye to the president's grave misconduct, blind eye to the overwhelming evidence of high crimes and misdemeanors. To my friends on the other side of the aisle, I say this. This is not about making history. This is about holding a lawless president accountable in the way our framers intended. This is a time to put our country over your political party. Do not seek safety in the high grass of a vote against these articles. We are all Americans. Show the American people your devotion to your country is more powerful than your loyalty to your political party. United, we can defend our democracy from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Divided, we risk losing our democracy. All you have to do is look at the evidence, because it will leave you with only one answer. The President of the United States must be impeached. Remember these facts. He tried to cheat, he got caught, he confessed, and then he obstructed the investigation into his misconduct. For our democracy, for our Constitution, for the people you represent, and for all who will inherit our country from us, I pray you will do the right thing. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this point, it gives me pleasure to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Rogers.
Gentleman is recognized, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in complete and total support of President Trump. The matter before the House today is based solely on a fundamental hatred of our president. It's a sham, a witch hunt, and is tantamount to a coup against the duly elected president of the United States. This is a sad day for our nation when one political party, along with their cohorts in the deep state and the mainstream media, try to hijack our Constitution. The Democrat majority has irresponsibly turned the impeachment process into a political weapon, something that Republicans refused to do when our base was calling for the impeachment of President Obama. It is well past time for the House to move beyond this hoax and put our nation first. That's exactly what President Trump is doing. The United States has record low unemployment, historic performance in the stock market. President Trump is rewriting failed trade deals of the past to put America first. He's rebuilding our military. He helped create the Space Force, and the list goes on. I implore my colleagues to end this spectacle now. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I'm hearing a lot from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, except a defense of President Trump's conduct, which is indefensible. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Some say this impeachment is about 8 lines in a call transcript, but there is so much more. This was about a scheme that lasted months and involved dozens of Trump administration officials. Look at the evidence. Look at the direct evidence. Text messages, emails, calls, and meetings. Way back in May, the president told his team, talk to Rudy Giuliani. The president's message, no White House meeting unless Ukraine helped him in the 2020 election. Ambassador Sondland said there was a prerequisite of investigations into the Bidens, and announcement of investigations was a deliverable. Ambassador Volker said the most important thing for the Ukrainian president to do was to commit to an investigation of the Bidens. Just before the July 25th call, Volker told the Ukrainians, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, we will nail down a date for a visit to Washington. The direct evidence kept coming after the call, more texts, more emails, more calls, all with the same message. If Ukraine didn't announce an investigation into the president's political rival, then they wouldn't get the White House meeting that they had been promised, and they wouldn't get the aid that they needed in their war against Russia. American presidential power comes from the people through elections. And the Constitution requires that we protect those elections. But when the president abused his power to solicit foreign interference, he was cheating American voters before they even had a chance to vote. President Trump's actions force us to protect our elections and the Constitution. I urge my colleague to defend the Constitution, support these articles of impeachment, and remind the world that in America, no one is above the law. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would remind this whole body that it is more than 8 lines. In fact, there's 4 facts. There's no pressure. There's no conditionality. They did nothing to get it, and they got the money. With that, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Spano.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in opposition to this political effort to remove President Trump from office. I'm not surprised this day has come, but I am disappointed. Disappointed because impeachment is one of the most consequential decisions that we can make in this body. And this impeachment is based purely on partisan motives. Speaker Pelosi said we shouldn't go down this path unless there was something compelling, overwhelming, and bipartisan because of how divisive it would be. Unfortunately, it's clear the majority has had laser focus on one thing for 3 years, impeaching the president. The majority has failed to deliver for the American people. They failed to pass a budget on time, failed to pass the spending bills on time, and failed to deliver bipartisan solutions that will actually help improve the lives of Americans. But the American people see through this sad charade for what it is, an attempt to undo the 2016 election based on hearsay and opinion, not fact. The transcript of the call showed no conditions were placed on the aid. President Trump and Zelensky have said there was no pressure and Ukraine received the aid without taking any actions. The Constitution is clear. The president may only be impeached for committing treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Nowhere in the 2 articles of impeachment brought today does it argue that the president has committed treason, bribery, or any crime under the law. This is not overwhelming. It is not compelling. It is not bipartisan. But the Speaker has right. She was right in one way. This is incredibly divisive and has lowered the bar for what future presidents will face. I strongly oppose the articles before us today, and I hope that we will finally move past this nightmare and get to work to deliver results for the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is again
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, the evidence is clear that President Trump took advantage of Ukraine's vulnerability and abused the powers of his office to pressure Ukraine to help his re-election campaign. This is the highest of high crimes, and President Trump must be held to account. Now, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. As a member of Homeland Security Committee, I know firsthand the dangers that foreign interference in our elections present to our democracy. And as a member of Congress, it is my sworn duty to ensure that our nation is secure from all threats, foreign and domestic. And Congress has a constitutional job to investigate allegations of misconduct by the executive branch, including the United States President. The Constitution is the highest law of the land, created a system of checks and balances to prevent the creation of a king. And Congress is a co-equal branch of our nation's government, equal with the presidency, with duties that are given to us by the framers. This is a very sad day, and I do not take impeachment lightly. Yet I'm here to do my job as a member of Congress. Mi pueblo me ha mandado a Washington para trabajar con todos, demócratas y republicanos, para mejorar nuestra vida en nuestras comunidades. Y tristemente estamos presentes considerando las acciones de nuestro presidente de los Estados Unidos. Y mi voto hoy será para asegurar que sigaremos siendo una democracia y no una dictadura. Muchos de nuestros hijos y hijas han pagado el precio de nuestra libertad con su sangre. Nuestra democracia tiene que ser la herencia de nuestros hijos. Y una democracia existe cuando nadie está sobre la Constitución y todos somos sujetos a las leyes. Y hoy también le pido a Dios que nos dé sabiduría y que nos ayude a unir a nuestra querida patria, los Estados Unidos americanos. And today I pray for God for his guidance in uniting our great nation. And with that, the gentleman from New York, I yield.
The gentleman will be required to provide a translation of your remarks. The gentleman from New York. Do you reserve, Mr. Nadler? Gentleman reserves. Mr. Collins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
I would just have to disagree with my chairman. I'm not sure what he's been watching, but facts are not undisputed. In fact, they're very much disputed, not only by the minority, but by the witnesses who actually testified. With that, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the Democrats' sham process, which makes a mockery of the rules of the House and is frankly dangerous to this country. Since day one, the Democrats have made it clear that they wanted to move towards impeachment well before any of the accusations took place. What Democrats unfortunately don't recognize is the damage that this will cause for our political institutions and America's trust for years to come. Every American should be concerned that Speaker Pelosi doesn't trust our citizens to let them decide who should lead our great country. This impeachment process isn't focused on strengthening and protecting our political foundations, but rather shaping public opinion. I ask you, is it worth that? Not only is the process alarming, but it's wasting taxpayers' dollars and valuable time that elected officials could be using to move our country forward. That includes securing our borders, addressing student loan debt, or bringing down the cost of health care and prescription drugs. I urge all of my colleagues, while considering these articles, to ask themselves whether this is truly being done for the good of the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
I would remind the gentleman that after recovering millions of dollars in ill-gotten gains, the Mueller investigation was actually a net plus for the taxpayers. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank Chairman Nadler and Speaker Pelosi for their leadership and their moral courage. Today, the House of Representatives is debating whether to take the rare step of voting to impeach a president for only the third time in our country's history. Unfortunately, President Trump has left us no choice. The fact of the matter is that the president abused the power of his office and invited a foreign country to interfere in our elections. In so doing, he undermined the sanctity of the free and fair elections upon which our republic rests. Making matters worse, over the past several months, President Trump and his administration have done everything they can to prevent Congress from uncovering the truth. Let us be clear, in the history of our republic, no president has ever obstructed Congress like this before. During the Watergate investigation, as my colleagues well know, President Nixon's chief of staff testified before Congress. President Trump's chief of staff refused. President Nixon's counsel testified. President Trump's refused. White House aides close to President Nixon testified. President Trump refused to allow any aide who may have knowledge relevant to this investigation to testify. Simply put, his administration has engaged in a wholesale obstruction of Congress, and that is exactly why we're considering not just one, but two articles of impeachment before the House today. Every member of this body has a responsibility to uphold our Constitution, to defend our republic, and when necessary, to hold the executive branch accountable. And we are exercising that responsibility today. So with that, and therefore, I will vote yes on both articles because it is what the Constitution requires and what my conscience demands. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wow, I'd have never thought that a Department of Justice investigation was used as a money revenue plot, but I guess one thing is true. It was a loser for the minority in a net profit situation. With that, I yield to Mr. Newhouse, a minute and a half.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the People's House should be better than this. We should be better than this. During a member's remarks in the Judiciary Committee, the committee's impeachment proceedings, he stated, and I quote, "To my Republican colleagues, how do you want to be remembered during this watershed moment in our nation's history?" Well, Mr. Speaker, it won't be watching sports on a laptop during official Judiciary Committee proceedings to impeach a sitting president. It won't be using expletives to refer to our president calling for his impeachment just hours after being sworn into Congress. It won't be using the chairmanship of the once respected Intelligence Committee to distort the president's words in order to mislead the American people. And it certainly won't be using the most serious and solemn powers of Congress to overturn a legitimate national election for political expediency. No, Mr. Speaker, my fellow Republican colleagues and I won't be remembered in history for doing any of those things, because we know this is far too grave a matter for subversions such as these of our democratic republic. We should all be better than this. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Mr. Nadler?
Speaker, may I inquire how much time remains on both sides?
Mr. Nadler, you're advised, sir, that you have 156 3/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 157 minutes remaining. Divide that by 60.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Our country faces a great tragedy and moment of truth. We have witnessed the President of the United States abuse his public office for personal political gain and invite foreign governments to interfere in our elections, putting the integrity of a government of, for, and by the people at great risk. The evidence is overwhelming and clearly shows that President Trump will continue to abuse his office and obstruct Congress if left unchecked. The Intelligence Committee conducted a robust investigation into the president's misconduct. Members interviewed 12 witnesses in public hearings totaling over 30 hours, conducted 17 depositions totaling over 100 hours, examined text messages and emails, reviewed the president's own words and actions, and published a 300-page report detailing their findings. All of this despite the fact that under the president's direction, 12 current and former administration officials refused to testify, even ignoring subpoenas, and 71 document requests were denied. The Judiciary Committee then reviewed the evidence and concluded that 2 articles of impeachment, which I support, were warranted. The evidence shows that President Trump is a clear and present danger to our free and fair elections and our national security. The most powerful evidence of this pattern has come from the president himself. In 2016, we heard him when he called on Russia to interfere in our elections. He said, "Russia, if you're listening." He then repeated this call for election interference on the July 25th call with the Ukrainian president, and we heard him again on the White House lawn, further adding China to that mix. I stand ready to protect our sacred republic, support these articles of impeachment, and I pray that my colleagues have the courage to do the same. We must uphold our oath of office, defend the Constitution and our fragile democracy, because no one is above the law. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rutherford.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, in 2016, Vladimir Putin and his cronies waged a war on our elections with the goal of sowing discord and division in America. Do you think he's been successful? Somewhere in Russia right now, Putin is laughing at us today. The majority has given him exactly what he wants: a divided America with a pure partisan politics, with nasty political rhetoric at an all-time high. And some, already across the aisle, are discrediting the results of future elections. Already. It seems to many Americans that for the past 3 years, the House majority has been carrying out the wishes of the Kremlin. And the sad part is the Democrats have vowed to continue their sham investigations even after today's vote. Impeaching a duly elected president in a purely partisan manner with no crimes to show for it, not one element of a crime defined, disgraces the integrity of our democracy. Now is the time to end the partisan politics, come together and put America first. I urge this body to vote no to partisan impeachment.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman reserves. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries.
Mr. Jeffries is recognized for 2 minutes.
George Washington, in his farewell address to the nation, counseled America that the Constitution is sacredly obligatory upon all. It is in that spirit that we proceed today. Donald Trump pressured a foreign government to target an American citizen for political gain, and at the same time withheld without justification $391 million in military aid to a vulnerable Ukraine as part of a scheme to solicit foreign interference in an American election. That is unacceptable. That is unconscionable. That is unconstitutional. There are some who cynically argue that the impeachment of this president will further divide an already fractured union. But there is a difference between division and clarification. Slavery once divided the nation, but emancipators rose up to clarify that all men are created equally. Suffrage once divided the nation, but women rose up to clarify that all voices must be heard in our democracy. Jim Crow once divided the nation, but civil rights champions rose up to clarify that all are entitled to equal protection under the law. There is a difference between division and clarification. We will hold this president accountable for his stunning abuse of power. We will hold this president accountable for undermining our national security. We will hold this president accountable for corrupting our democracy. We will impeach Donald John Trump. We will clarify that in America, no one is above the law.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I now yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, nullifying a national election requires an overwhelming case of high crimes supported by indisputable evidence that the vast majority of the nation finds compelling. Now, Article 1 is a made-up crime called abuse of office. It does not charge that the president broke any law, but that Congress doesn't like the way he lawfully discharged his constitutional duties. This would reduce the presidency to that of a minister serving at the pleasure of Congress, destroying the separation of powers at the heart of our Constitution. Article 2 is another made-up crime called obstruction of Congress. It means the president sought to defend his constitutional rights and those of his office. It removes the judiciary from our Constitution and places Congress alone in the position of defining the limits of its own powers relative to the president. Our Bill of Rights guarantees every American the right to confront their accuser, to call witnesses in their defense, to be protected from hearsay, and to defend these rights in court. The Democrats have trampled them all in their stampede to impeach. Even in this kangaroo court, the Democrats handpicked witnesses provided no firsthand knowledge the president leaked aid to action. In fact, 2 witnesses provided firsthand knowledge that he specifically ordered no quid pro quo. Any case that charged no actual crime and offered no legally admissible evidence would be laughed out of court in a heartbeat. That's the case before us today. It would redefine the grounds for impeachment in such a way that assures that it will become a constant presence in our national life. Now we know just how reckless is the Democrats' chant of resist by any means necessary. This is a stunning abuse of power and a shameless travesty of justice that will stain the reputations of those responsible for generations to come. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, abuse of power was no vague or weak notion to the framers. It had a very specific meaning: the use of official power to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or injuring the national interest. President Trump has abused his office and must be removed. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, from our founding, the United States has been a special nation, a city upon a hill. Our values are enshrined in our Constitution: liberty, equality, and opportunity. We are a self-governing people where every person is equal before the law. In the United States, we don't have a king. We choose our leaders. We vote. Generations of Americans have fought, and some have died, to secure these inalienable rights. The Constitution begins, "We, the people of the United States." That's us. It's not we, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, or China, or we, the Democrats, or we, the Republicans. It's we, the people of the United States, and all Americans, and only Americans, get to have a say in our elections. Donald Trump used the high power of the presidency to pressure a foreign nation to besmirch his perceived primary political opponent. He corrupted our elections and compromised our national security so that he could keep power. Not power for the people, power for himself. In 2016, candidate Trump called for foreign interference when he said, "Russia, if you are listening." In 2019, President Trump sought foreign interference when he needed a favor from Ukraine to intervene in the 2020 elections. President Trump attacked and is a continuing threat to our system of free and fair elections. Like all of you, I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution. I urge my colleagues to abide by that oath and stand up to President Trump's abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. To my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I appeal to your patriotism and implore you to defend free and fair elections and preserve the Constitution. God save the United States of America. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and the gentleman and all members are reminded to address their comments to the chair. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I do believe, Mr. Speaker, that our election should be free and fair. I do believe that with all my heart, except it seems like in this case, this impeachment is based on the fact that the Speaker, who said in this month, last month, it would be dangerous to leave it to the voters to determine if Mr. Trump stays in office. With that, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have descended into the belly of the beast. I have witnessed the terror within, and I rise committed to oppose the insidious forces which threaten our republic. America is being severely injured by this betrayal, by this unjust and weaponized impeachment brought upon us by the same socialists who threaten unborn life in the womb, who threaten First Amendment rights of conservatives, who threatened Second Amendment protections of every American patriot, and who have long ago determined that they would organize and conspire to overthrow President Trump. We don't face this horror because the Democrats have all of a sudden become constitutionalists. We're not being devoured from within because of some surreal assertion of the socialists' newfound love for the very flag that they trod upon. We face this horror because of this map. This is what the Democrats fear. They fear the true will of we, the people. They are deep establishment, D.C. They fear. They call this Republican map flyover country. They call us deplorables. They fear our faith. They fear our strength. They fear our unity. They fear our vote. And they fear our president. We will never surrender our nation to career establishment D.C. politicians and bureaucrats. Our republic shall survive this threat from within. American patriots shall prevail. Mr. Speaker, I yield.
The gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was not among those who supported impeachment before Ukraine, but I called for impeachment today because our president is, as we speak, abusing his power and placing himself above the law. President Trump's attempt to sabotage the 2020 election is a clear and present danger on our democracy. We, the people, know this, and more Americans support impeachment today than at any time since Richard Nixon's final weeks in office. We know that it's wrong to enlist the help of foreigners in interfering in our elections. We know it's wrong to cheat, and we know what's at stake. It's not just that our elections were attacked, our elections are under attack right now. The very day the Judiciary Committee voted out articles of impeachment, President Trump welcomed Rudy Giuliani back to the White House. President Trump is still at it. He's doubling down. He doesn't think he can win an election fair and square, so he's trying to cheat. To ignore these crimes is not just giving the president a pass, it's giving him a green light. Those who vote against impeachment are not just endorsing President Trump's past actions, but his future ones as well. If you think I exaggerate in warning that our elections can be undermined, I'd urge you to come down to Georgia, find a black man or woman of a certain age, and they'll tell you the danger is real. And they'll tell you of brave Americans, patriots willing to risk far more than a political career, who marched and struggled and sometimes died so that we could have fair and free elections. We're not asked to possess even a fraction of their courage. We're simply called upon today to do what's right. And I'm proud to vote yes on impeachment, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm glad that my colleague, Madam Speaker, just mentioned Georgia, because since 2014, the actual voter participation among minorities, African-American female, African-American male, and Hispanic female, have risen double digits. I'm very proud of what Georgia's doing to get everybody to the poll. I'm glad he chose to highlight it. Unfortunately, he just highlighted it in the wrong way, and I will not yield. Madam Speaker, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Muser.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Gentleman from Georgia. Madam Speaker, back home, people refer to Capitol Hill as a bubble. They are right. It's as if we are completely detached from what's going on in communities across America. Many here don't hear or listen to what people are saying, and many here as well think they know better than the people we serve. Our communities are benefiting greatly from President Trump's agenda: a booming economy, secure border, better trade deals, and a stronger military. Unfortunately, inside the halls of Congress, Democrats' obsession with impeachment is all-consuming. Is this how Democrat leadership chooses to represent the people of America? By nullifying the results of the 2016 election, disregarding the will of the American people, and doing everything in their power to prevent the president and this Congress from doing the job we were elected to do? After 3 years of trying, months of unfair, politically motivated impeachment proceedings, Democrats have delivered 2 weak articles of impeachment. Abuse of power? Not according to the Ukraine. President Zelensky confirmed many times that there was no quid pro quo, no action taken, and significant military aid was delivered without anything in return. Of course, his words have been conveniently dismissed. Obstruction of Congress? Is this the new standard? If this is the new standard, then every president since Jimmy Carter and every president moving forward would and will be impeached. Let me be clear. It is an honor to serve in the United States House of Representatives, but today, I am distraught. Today, Democrats will disregard the will of the American people and vote to impeach the duly elected President of the United States. What should be equally troubling is that this has eroded, if not wiped out, the trust the American people have in the 116th Congress.
Gentleman from New York.
I yield back.
I reserve.
Madam Speaker, President Trump said no quid pro quo only after the White House learned of the whistleblower complaint and after the Washington Post had published an article about the president's pressure campaign on Ukraine. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from California, Ms. Bass.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, this is a sad day in U.S. history when we have to vote on articles of impeachment because Donald Trump has abused the power of the office of the presidency in his attempt to cheat his way to re-election. The facts are uncontested. Fact 1. The president abused the power of his office by attempting to shake down the president of a country that has been our ally. Trump wanted President Zelensky of the Ukraine to make up dirt on Vice President Biden because he sees him as the biggest threat to his re-election. Fact 2. Trump wanted Zelensky to go before the press and announce an investigation of Biden, hoping the mere announcement would create doubt about Biden and strengthen Trump's hand in the 2020 election. Fact 3, Trump obstructed Congress by engaging in a cover-up. Trump has refused to comply with congressional subpoenas and has blocked current and past employees from testifying before congressional committees. Congress is a co-equal branch of government, and one of our central responsibilities is to provide oversight and investigation of the administration. The very checks and balances the framers built into the Constitution so no one branch would have unchecked power. The House of Representatives has no choice but to vote and pass articles of impeachment because President Trump has abused his power and obstructed the ability of Congress from performing our constitutional duty. The urgency to move forward with articles of impeachment is because there is no reason to believe President Trump won't continue to abuse the power of his office. No reason to believe he won't continue to put his foot on the scale of his re-election. And in fact, his attorney just returned from the Ukraine, and in an article just released in the New Yorker magazine, confesses to continuing the effort to interfere in the election. In many of our congressional districts, we worry about voter suppression and schemes that purge legitimate voters from participating in the election. Or we worry about Russian interference in our election. It is a sad day in America when we have to worry about the commander-in-chief interfering in the election in order to be reelected. Elections should be decided by the American people. I will vote for both articles of impeachment. It is my constitutional duty that fulfill my oath of office. No one is above the law.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I discovered something recently. It's shocking, I know, but it turns out that some people don't like President Trump. They think he's loud, they think he can be arrogant, they think sometimes he says bad words, and sometimes he's rude to people, and to their sensitive natures, they've been offended. I get that, I really do. But let's be clear, this vote, this day, has nothing to do with Ukraine. It has nothing to do with abuse of power. It has nothing to do with obstruction of Congress. This vote, this day, is about one thing and one thing only. They hate this president. They hate those of us who voted for him. They think we're stupid. They think we made a mistake. They think Hillary Clinton should be the president, and they want to fix that. That's what this vote is about. They want to take away my vote and throw it in the trash. They want to take away my president and delegitimize him so that he cannot be reelected. That's what this vote is about. And for those who think this started with this investigation, what nonsense. You've been trying to impeach this president since before he was sworn into office. Some of you introduced articles of impeachment before he was sworn into office. This isn't something you're approaching prayerfully and mournfully and sadly. Oh, the chaos, oh, the sadness. This is something you're gleeful about. And you've been trying to do it for 3 years. And it's very clear. You don't have to go back and Google very much to find out that is the absolute truth. I could give you pages of examples of things you have said for 3 years about this president. That's what this is about. And if you think if this impeachment is successful, the next president, I promise you, is going to be impeached. And the next president after that, if you set this bar as being impeachable, every president in our future will be impeached. It erodes our republic in ways that our founding fathers recognized. They got it right. High crimes and misdemeanors. Other than that, settle it at the ballot box. I look forward to that day. Let the American people decide.
Members are reminded to direct their comments to the chair. Gentleman from New York.
Reserve.
Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that if President Trump is impeached and removed, the new president will be Mike Pence, not Hillary Clinton. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlelady from Florida, Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
I'm sorry. The gentleman yields 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Gentleladies recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I did not have the privilege of being born into this country. My mother brought me from Ecuador looking for freedom and opportunity, but that's not my story alone. This is a story that I share with so many people that live in Florida's 26th district and all over the country. We've left and experienced corruption in our countries of birth where brutal dictatorships have choked their potential to benefit those in power. This president, elected by the American people, has violated his oath of office and violated the rule of law. The evidence is overwhelming that he withheld military aid approved by Congress and leveraged a White House meeting to extract a political favor from a foreign government. The president actively sought foreign election interference to benefit himself. It is undeniable that he has abused his power and obstructed Congress. He presents a clear and present danger to our democracy. As an immigrant, I still get chills because I feel so fortunate to live in this extraordinary country. The genius of American democracy lies in our Constitution and the dedication to the rule of law. I want my children and all of our children to feel the same way when they grow up. However, if we sit idly by as cracks begin to appear in our democratic institutions, our children will be in the same situation like so many of us experienced when we left countries whose leaders destroyed democracy. We in Congress must abide by our oath to defend our Constitution. That is my duty as a member of this body. That is my duty as a mother. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. King.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong opposition to the articles of impeachment against President Trump. As Chairman Nadler must recall, exactly 21 years ago today, I spoke on this floor in opposition to the impeachment of President Clinton. And 21 years ago tomorrow, I voted against all 4 articles of impeachment against President Clinton. Today's articles of impeachment against President Trump are an assault on our Constitution and the American people. To impeach a president for a phone call for which no crime is charged, never mind a high crime, and asserting his constitutional prerogatives as president is a clear abuse of power by the Congress. It sets the dangerous precedent of weaponizing impeachment to undo the solemn decision of the American people. Madam Speaker, President Trump and I grew up in the same borough of New York City. And today I am proud to stand with President Trump and urge a no vote on these horrible acts of impeachment, these articles of impeachment. I yield back the balance of my time and strongly urge a no vote.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Lofgren.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the President and members of Congress each take an oath to uphold the Constitution. When the President abuses his presidential power to upend the constitutional order, we have an obligation to live up to our oath of office. We've been presented with direct evidence about the President's actions. They threaten our national security and undermine the integrity of the next election. We now vote on articles of impeachment for abuse of power and contempt of Congress as a result of that evidence. I've worked on presidential impeachments as part of the Judiciary Committee twice before. This third time brings me no joy. President Nixon attempted to corrupt elections. His agents broke into the Democratic Party headquarters to get a leg up on the election, and then, just like President Trump, he tried to cover it up. Then he resigned. This is even worse. President Trump not only abused his power to help his reelection, he used a foreign government to do it. He used military aid provided to fight the Russians as leverage, solely to benefit his own political campaign. George Washington would be astonished, since he warned against the insidious wiles of foreign influence. The direct evidence is damning. The president hasn't offered any evidence to the contrary. These actions constitute grounds for presidential impeachment. What is before us is a serious abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. These abuses strike at the heart of our Constitution. The president's unconstitutional abuse of power, a high crime and misdemeanor, is ongoing. He totally refused to provide any information to Congress related to the impeachment inquiry. It's our responsibility to use the tool our founders gave us in the Constitution to preserve the constitutional order. We must impeach, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Rouser.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, the Washington Post headlined a story immediately following President Trump taking the oath of office, stating, "The campaign to impeach President Trump has begun." How accurate they were. Here we are almost 3 years later, and what we are witnessing today is unprecedented in American history. A very partisan-based impeachment with no facts that warrant it. This is an impeachment based on hearsay and speculation, rooted in a deep-seated hatred for a man for whom many of my colleagues on the other side detest. Not all, but many. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that personal disdain is grounds for impeachment. At every turn, the claims made by my Democrat colleagues have turned out to be false. Early on, it was claimed there was evidence of Russian collusion. There was none. We were told the FBI didn't abuse the FISA process in its investigation of the Trump campaign. That, too, has now been proven completely false. Then, when the Russian collusion hoax collapsed, we were told that we would hear from a whistleblower that had details of a nefarious call between the president and the president of Ukraine. Then we find out they weren't even on the call, and we still don't even know who the whistleblower is. We were told there was clear evidence of a quid pro quo for personal gain. After reading the transcript, it is obvious that you have to make assumptions that wouldn't even stand up in traffic court to come to that conclusion. Instead, the indisputable facts of record destroy their case. And though they allege treason and bribery by the president, the articles we are considering today only make vague accusations of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, because they found no evidence of treason or bribery or anything else for that matter. Mr. Speaker, today is a very sad day for our republic.
Gentleman from New York.
The country is now divided.
Gentleman's recognized.
The country is now more divided than it ever has been in my lifetime. The truth has been trampled by this House of Representatives, and because of the abuses at the FBI and the Department of Justice, more Americans have an even dimmer view of very important American institutions. Thankfully, the lens of history will ensure that the truth is told and will endure.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, one specific concern of the framers was a president who would corrupt our elections, who would abuse the great powers of his office to ensure his own re-election. The impeachment inquiry is not an effort to overturn an election. It is a reaffirmation of the simple truth that in the United States of America, no person, not even the president, is above the law, and our democracy cannot allow a duly elected president to abuse the power of his office for personal and political gain. And I now yield 2.5 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I hate no woman or man. Today, the American people should receive clarity and truth. The Constitution is the highest law of the land. The President breached and violated the Constitution of the United States of America. The President committed constitutional crimes. The President's crimes are impeachable. John F. Kennedy said, if this country should ever reach the point where any man or group of men by force or threat of force could defy the commands of our courts and Constitution, then no law would stand free from doubt and no citizen would be safe from his neighbors. The facts are undisputed. First, President Trump violated his oath of office by placing his personal political interests above the national interest by scheming to coerce Ukraine into investigating a potential election opponent. Second, President Trump betrayed the nation by withholding the congressionally agreed $391 million to a fragile ally against a very strong foe, Russia. Third, the essential purpose of the scheme concocted by the president was to enlist a foreign country to help in the 2020 election. These acts are constitutional crimes and abuse of power. The truth is, the president did ask for a favor. Those were his own words. In the July 25th call, no mention of corruption, only the mention of the Bidens. The president was engaged in wrongdoing, and it's a clear and present danger. He has a pattern, and his behavior remains a continuing threat to America's national security. The truth is that abuse of power does violate the Constitution, while both corrupting and cheating our American democracy. His acts betrayed the nation. He must take care to execute laws faithfully. This is the truth. Why does the truth matter? Because it matters to the farmer at his or her plow. It matters to the waitress on an early morning shift. It matters to the steel worker building America. It matters to the teacher in a 5th grade class. It matters to a mother kissing off her military recruit going off to war. The Constitution must be preserved. Our laws must be honored and respected. The bloodshed and sacrifice of fellow Americans cannot be ignored, trampled on, or rejected. And today, our actions on the vote taken today must be for no personal gain or grandeur. The bright light of this constitutional democracy has been dimmed because of his acts. The truth is no longer for all. It is for one man, Donald J. Trump. His truth, his way. We must reject that abuse of power because this is not America. No one is above the law. Alexander Hamilton said impeachment was designed to deal with the misconduct of public men and violation of public trust. The president has violated the trust. We must impeach Donald J. Trump.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it's my pleasure to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Today, the House of Representatives votes on 2 articles of impeachment for President Trump. Members and all Americans must recognize that impeachment was intended to be a safety valve, rarely used, only when a president acts in such an immoral and blatantly unlawful manner as to threaten the very basis of our republic. As we cast votes on these articles, the future tone of this House and politics in this nation must be carefully considered. The issue is not whether we agree with or like the president's rhetoric, political tactics, use of Twitter, policy choices, or his political rallies. One of our founders, Alexander Hamilton, warned of the risks of impeachment becoming a solely partisan act in the Federalist Papers. This impeachment inquiry and these articles clearly do not heed that warning. These proceedings are weaponizing impeachment, making it another election tool. I've carefully examined the evidence presented throughout the inquiry, and contrary to some, considered our history, our founding documents, and our future. It is clear President Trump's actions, as described in these articles, do not constitute treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. You simply don't like him. I'll be voting no on these articles and will hope someday we return to serving the needs of the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, President Trump on January 20th, 2017 raised his hand and swore to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Now we must preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution from him. Madam Speaker, I rise today not to disparage and embarrass the President of the United States, but to defend our precious democracy. I speak today not because I hate this president, but because I love this body, the people's house. I have heard Republicans say, why are we rushing to judgment? This is not a rush to judgment. It's a rush to justice, and we must not delay. Corruption is corrosive. It eats away like acid, and the longer we wait, the more time we allow for this president to do irreparable harm to our country and our democracy. Just last week, Rudy Giuliani was back at it in Ukraine. So please don't tell us to wait, because the corruption continues. There's a famous quote that says, politicians worry about the next election. Statesmen worry about the next generation. Today calls upon us to be statesmen and stateswomen, Democrat, Republican, and independent. Our election is under attack from within. So to my Republican colleagues, many of whom spend a lifetime trying to build a reputation of honesty and courage, I beg you, don't throw that away for President Trump. He doesn't deserve it, nor will he appreciate it past the next tweet or next week. My fear and my prediction is that his actions will continue. Madam Speaker, Donald Trump recently said, I can do anything I want. He also bragged that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. Well, he's shooting holes in our Constitution on Pennsylvania Avenue. And our House, the People's House, must defend the Constitution from a domestic enemy to the rule of law, Donald Trump. Because I don't want generations to come to blame me for letting our democracy die, I therefore rise in favor of impeaching Donald Trump. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Lukemeyer.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in strong opposition to this political charade that has tormented our country for nearly 3 years. If there was ever any doubt that this entire illegitimate investigation is 100% politically motivated, earlier this month, Speaker Pelosi actually admitted the impeachment process began 2.5 years ago. Let me say that again. The Speaker of the House said publicly that the Democrats have been trying to remove our president from office since the day he got elected, simply because it was not the outcome they wanted. Another of my Democrat colleagues publicly admitted in May that the driving force behind their actions was, and I quote, if we don't impeach the president, he'll get reelected. This wasn't an investigation, Madam Speaker. This was a political crusade. In order to arrive at their Stalinistic, predetermined conclusion, House Democrats spent the last several months staging well-rehearsed hearings where the charges were drawn up by their own focus groups, Democrat donors served as witnesses, and Democrat staff served as judge and jury. Even with the odds so blatantly stacked against the president, Democrats still came up with absolutely nothing. A while ago, the Speaker spoke of the Pledge of Allegiance. The last phrase of the pledge is justice for all. Justice was not something afforded the president during the investigation. He was denied due process, something the Supreme Court said should be afforded in all congressional investigations. That makes this process illegal and illegitimate. What a shame. What a sham. With that, I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I didn't come to Congress to impeach the president, even when he separated babies from their parents at the border, even when he took money from our troops to build his wall. No, I didn't call for impeachment, because I'm here to make a difference in the lives of my constituents. Yet here we are in the middle of a constitutional crisis. As a former judge, I took my responsibility seriously to weigh the evidence and determine if the president's actions were impeachable. Unfortunately, the evidence in the intelligence and judiciary reports leaves us with no choice but to impeach the president. So I stand on my oath that I have sworn to the Constitution and to the American people. And today, I urge my colleagues to stand by their oaths too. The framers of the Constitution included impeachment as a safeguard against a corrupt president whose misconduct could destroy the very foundations of our country. Donald J. Trump abused his power when he obstructed Congress and ordered government officials not to appear before us. Donald J. Trump corrupted our election when he asked a foreign government to interfere for his personal and political gain. Today, sadly, I ask my colleagues, will you put your party over our country, or will you help save our democracy and vote yes on the articles of impeachment before you? I urge you to vote yes. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I do have an inquiry as to the time remaining for both sides.
Gentleman from Georgia has 2 hours, 22 and a half minutes. Gentleman from New York has 2 hours and 27 and a half minutes left.
Pulled ahead. Okay. Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, it is my, I yield now to a minute and a half to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. King.
Gentleman's recognized for for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank the gentleman for yielding. And I start out first that this is the largest, most massive cover-up of such a list of crimes against our country, and to go so far as to bring impeachment hearings to try to cover all of this up. And I would take you back to October of 2015 when Barack Obama said Hillary Clinton would never intend to jeopardize our national security. Again, the following April, the next month, Peter Strzok wrote the statement that was delivered by James Comey, and they spent Democrat money and Hillary Clinton money in Russia to pick up dirt on Donald Trump. And then Joe Biden goes to Ukraine and makes the statement, here's $1 billion, but you must do what I tell you to do. You're accusing Donald Trump of doing that which Joe Biden has confessed to doing. And by the way, Joe Biden was not the opponent of Donald Trump. He's in a 21-way primary for Democrats. He's running third in that race. His opponents are the other 20 Democrats. How would anybody dig into that mess of 21 people and decide he's going to go overseas and pull some maneuver like this? You have to assign him a motive. You assign him a motive, then you create the dots, then you go dot to dot. But the reality is that it was Biden that was doing the extortion of the power play in order to protect his own son. And it was Donald Trump that was following the law that said you have to ensure that there's not corruption here before this money is handed over. And by the way, there was a violent war going on in Ukraine, and that's when we sent blankets and MREs over there under Barack Obama. So but when I hear this from the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, he doesn't think he can win the election fair and square, so he would cheat. And I've heard that here on this floor. No, it's the other way around. Your #1 proponent of impeachment is Al Green of Texas, and he said those very same things, and they brought this case November 9th, the day after Trump was elected. I yield back.
I yield. Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, words matter. We've heard many words over the course of these last weeks. Still, what strikes me are the words that are missing from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. A gaping hole in this conversation. The words they cannot or will not mouth. Defending a president's conduct. Conduct that threatens our constitutional order. And so, Speaker, I ask, when is it ever right for a president to coerce a foreign power to interfere in our elections? When is it ever right for a president to intimidate a foreign leader into announcing false investigations into a political rival? When is it ever right for that president to withhold congressionally appropriated aid to that country at the expense of its national security and our very own? And when is it ever right for a president to block a co-equal branch of government from investigating the scheme to cheat an election? The answer, of course, is never. But that word does not come trippingly from the tongues of those who are making the choice to stand behind a man whose behavior is not worthy of your tortured words. By our vote today, we are speaking to future presidents and to future generations. We are declaring that we will not tolerate foreign interference in our presidential elections. Americans alone will determine the outcome, and we will not permit a president to order the complete defiance of a co-equal branch of government. And in the end, regardless of the outcome of this impeachment, the president's tenure will end, and this body and our grandchildren will be left with what we did here today. Ours is a somber generational duty about love of country and lifting a Constitution to its gravest protections but its highest aspirations. Our democracy is a matter of conscience, and by voting to safeguard our Constitution, mine is clear. I thank you, Madam Speaker, and yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As I've reminded many times, we have followed the sham process that we've had to deal with, and we've followed the facts and won both. And I will remind that if you want to talk about elections, remember it was the Speaker of the House that said we can't trust the voters it's too dangerous to leave it with the voters for President Trump next year. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As you all know, I serve on both the Judiciary Committee and Rules Committee, and I have literally spent hours poring over testimony, looking at documents, sitting in hearings. And you know the conclusion I got from all of that? This impeachment is a total joke and a total sham. And let me tell you one of the reasons why I think that. All of those witnesses, the 17 witnesses that the Democrats brought forward, not one single one of them was able to establish that President Trump committed bribery, treason, high crimes, or misdemeanors, which is required in the U.S. Constitution. And again, 17 out of 24 Democrat members on Judiciary Committee voted on this floor to move forward articles of impeachment before the phone call. And 5 out of 9 Rule Committee Democrat members did the same thing. So if the main part of your impeachment is the call, why did you vote for impeachment prior to the call? I also want to remind the American public and others that for 2 years, Adam Schiff claimed he had proof that President Trump had colluded with Russia. That turned out to be false. And then overnight, it was obstruction of justice, then quid pro quo, then bribery, then extortion. And the list goes on, but yet not one of those is listed in the articles of impeachment. To my Democrat colleagues, Madam Chair, I say, please stop tearing the country apart. Stop this sham. And I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
The gentlelady is correct. President Trump's behavior is not new. He has a pattern of engaging in misconduct and then obstructing any investigation into his misconduct to cover up his actions and hide the truth from the American people. I now yield to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Roybal Allard, for the purpose of a unanimous consent request.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Okay, Madam Speaker, I rise in support of today's impeachment proceedings and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, Madam Speaker. Our nation was founded on certain principles: that government should be of, by, and for the people; that a system of three co-equal branches of government would provide the checks and balances necessary to ensure the people's voices are heard, and that no one is above the law. Today, sadly, we are voting to impeach President Donald John Trump because he has fundamentally broken his covenant with the American people. In doing so, we are using the powers the Founding Fathers enshrined in the Constitution to address a president who has violated his oath of office. The evidence is clear and the facts are not in question. President Trump is consistently engaged in a pattern of behavior inconsistent with the rule of law. He has refused to take responsibility for his actions. He has undermined the checks and balances we rely on by obstructing Congress at every turn. And most importantly, he has abused his power by using his office to solicit foreign interference in our elections, undermining the will of the people. So on this sad day for our nation, I will do what the president has so often failed to do, and I will fulfill my oath to support and defend the Constitution, and I will vote in favor of impeachment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Chavez.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today is a sad day in our nation's history as House Democrats are poised to approve on a strictly party line vote articles of impeachment based on what constitutional scholar Jonathan Turley called wafer-thin evidence. This will set a dangerous precedent where impeachment becomes the norm rather than the exception. That's not what our founding fathers intended. They wanted impeachment to be rare. They set a high bar for impeachment: treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. Alleged abuse of power, the first article, is not a high crime and misdemeanor. In fact, it's not even a crime. And since there's no concise legal definition of abuse of power, the majority party in the House can designate nearly any disagreement with the president from now on an impeachable offense. The second article, alleged obstruction of Congress, would produce a similarly dangerous precedent. Asserting executive privilege, a practice that began with George Washington, is not obstruction of Congress. Rather, it's a function of the essential checks and balances contemplated under the Constitution. Here's what nearly every grade school student in America knows, but apparently House Democrats do not. If Congress disagrees with the president, if they don't agree with the president, take it to court. Let the third branch of government decide. They're the refs. The House has never, I repeat, never approved either abuse of power or obstruction of Congress as an article of impeachment. But that's going to change today. Today, House Democrats are pursuing a wacky constitutional theory under which all four presidents on Mount Rushmore could have been impeached. If all of this sounds absurd, Madam Speaker, it's because it is absurd. In fact, this whole process is absurd and has been from the outset. But here's what's not absurd, but rather frightening. House Democrats today are setting a dangerous precedent under which no future president will be immune from impeachment, and that will forever negatively tarnish the history of this House. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, the president's conduct constituted the highest of high crimes against our country. An offense does not have to violate a criminal statute to be impeachable. That was confirmed in President Nixon's case and again in President Clinton's. There is no higher crime than for the president to use the power of his office to corrupt our elections. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This July, President Trump blocked $400 million in congressionally approved aid that Ukraine desperately needed to defend itself against Russia, because he needed Ukraine to do him a favor first. He asked the president of Ukraine to launch a public investigation into a political rival. Military aid and other benefits would only come after. But this is not about a single call or a single transcript. This is about a perfect storm, months of activity directly ordered by the president to his senior cabinet and political appointees, an orchestrated plan demanding a foreign power interfere in our democracy. President Trump betrayed his oath of office. He abused the power of his office for personal and political gain and has refused to cooperate with a co-equal branch of government. This is a vote for our Constitution, setting the precedent for all future presidents, Democrat or Republican. Donald Trump must be held accountable for his actions. Today, we send a clear signal to this president and all future presidents. No one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
I rise today in opposition to the impeachment of the legitimately elected President of the United States. Enough. Madam Speaker, for the love of this country, enough. Enough of this impeachment circus. Enough of these sham witch hunts. I'm voting no because the president has done nothing wrong. The only thing the President Trump is guilty of is doing the things he said he would do. And if my Democrat colleagues were honest, they'd tell us the only thing President Trump is guilty of is not being Hillary Clinton. The only party guilty of obstruction, abuse of power, or whatever focus group term they're using today is the party on the other side of this aisle. They're obstructing the will of the American people. They're obstructing the very foundations of our country. By politically weaponizing impeachment, they have dangerously shattered precedent and abused our Constitution. They alone will bear this responsibility. Madam Speaker, they'll fail. And it's no wonder the American people don't trust this body. It's past time to be done with this circus and get to the work that matters, like securing our borders and passing trade deals. I will vote no and encourage this body to move on from this heartbreaking, disgraceful day to things that actually matter. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Price.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the moment our founders anticipated in establishing the power of impeachment has arrived. The evidence is clear. President Trump abused his power by asking a vulnerable foreign leader to investigate both his political rival and a baseless Russian conspiracy theory, while withholding congressionally appropriated defense aid and a coveted White House visit. He then blocked congressional investigation into these abuses. These abuses threaten the integrity of our elections, they corrupt our diplomacy, and they undermine national security. We sometimes regard constitutional checks and balances as the indestructible underpinnings of our democracy. In fact, they're not fixed. They're not indestructible. The president has demonstrated this beyond all doubt. It's up to the Congress, the first branch of government, to apply the remedy that the Constitution prescribes, because the threats to our democracy are real and present. With this vote, we affirm that no one, including the president, is above the law.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Since the beginning of this impeachment inquiry, it's been extremely troubling to see the partisan, divisive way in which Democrats have carried out this entire process. I guess we shouldn't be surprised, though. They promised they'd unseat this president since the day he took his oath of office. From the start, this has been a baseless attempt to undo the will of 63 million Americans who voted for President Trump. I can tell you, the people I represent in Kentucky, the very people who voted for this president to enact change and fight for this country, are appalled at the charade they've seen in the House in recent months. They are appalled at the actions from House Democrats who have failed to even come close to proving their case. I hope all of my congressional colleagues carefully consider the precedent they are setting by voting in favor of this sham process and these illegitimate articles of impeachment. These articles were written and built on a report that was drafted with biased presumptions, cherry-picked witnesses, and vastly disputed facts. The president did not commit any impeachable offense, and it's clear for all of us to see through the now very well-known transcript. This rigged process sets a concerning precedent for impeachable offenses moving forward, and I wholeheartedly oppose these baseless articles of impeachment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Many have lamented that this effort is not bipartisan, but that's on my Republican colleagues. Republicans have not sought the truth. They have sought to avoid the truth. They have demeaned and insulted witnesses, patriots, warriors, career diplomats who provided evidence against the president. No House Republican has joined us to demand the documents and witnesses that President Trump has refused to produce. And Senate Republican leaders this week have announced that President Trump himself can set the rules of his own trial, and there will be no fact witnesses. Republicans refuse to seek the truth and condemn the abuse of power, or to work with us to prevent this ongoing behavior in the future. And that's the tragedy of today's events. In our nation's history, thousands of Americans have gone into battle without reservation to fight for our republic, as they still do today. Many have been gravely injured, and some have made the ultimate sacrifice. But today, in contrast, for fear of losing an election, my colleagues will not speak up for the rule of law or against presidential abuse of power. Voters may give them a pass, but history will judge them harshly. I will vote for the articles of impeachment. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is my privilege now to yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Loudermilk.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank my colleague from Georgia and friend, Mr. Collins. Madam Speaker, I rise today in opposition not only to these articles of impeachment, but in strong opposition to the process that has brought us to this point. Our Constitution and Bill of Rights are all about process. Our founders knew that a government without constraints could accuse anyone of any crime at any time, even without compelling evidence. That's why the 5th and the 14th Amendments established a bedrock principle of innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But on November the 14th, Speaker Pelosi informed the press that the president should prove his innocence when she stated, "Mr. President, if you have anything that shows your innocence, then he should make that known." The Constitution also guarantees that the accused can call witnesses to testify on their behalf, but the Republicans and the president were continually denied that right throughout this process. The Sixth Amendment guarantees the right of the defendant to face their accuser, but not only have the Democrats prohibited Republicans and the president from questioning the so-called whistleblower, his identity has been kept secret. Before you take this historic vote today, 1 week before Christmas, I want you to keep this in mind. When Jesus was falsely accused of treason, Pontius Pilate gave Jesus the opportunity to face his accusers. During that sham trial, Pontius Pilate afforded more rights to Jesus than the Democrats have afforded this president in this process. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
The president was given the opportunity to come and testify before the Judiciary Committee, to send his counsel, to question witnesses. He declined to do so. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee.
Rise for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is a sad day for our country and for our democracy. The president has abused the powers of his office, betrayed the public trust, and undermined America's national security by pressuring a foreign government to interfere in our elections for his own political gain. In this moment in our history, the Constitution is clear. The remedy for such misconduct by a president is impeachment. I didn't come here to Congress to impeach a president of the United States, but sadly, the president's misconduct leaves us no choice but to follow the Constitution. I have 2 grandchildren. My granddaughter Caitlin is 8, and my grandson Colin is 4. Someday, a long time from now, they'll ask me about this day. They'll ask about the time a president put himself above the law, and they'll want to know what I did to stop him. and I will have an answer for them. Today, I vote to uphold the Constitution. I will vote to impeach Donald Trump. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is interesting that the president was supposedly given rights in the Judiciary Committee, but maybe who would he have asked questions of? 3 law school professors and a staff member? Not a lot of due process there. With this, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Madam Speaker, we're here today because House Democrats have spent upwards of $30 million in 3 years trying to overturn the 2016 election of President Trump and come up with nothing. Because of their radical left wing, Democrats are willing to make all future presidential elections invalid until judged worthy by the majority in the House of Representatives. The President of the United States does not serve at the pleasure of the House of Representatives. Perhaps the greatest denial of reality regarding President Trump is acknowledging that under his policies, things are actually going much better than they have in decades for working Americans. We are a democratic constitutional republic in which power flows from we the people to our president and elected officials. The Democrat majority thinks otherwise. They believe that they are entitled to rule us, even if they have to change the rules to invalidate the will and the votes of the people of America. And that is why the absence of a case does not matter in this charade of impeachment. I believe that the American people recognize and share my urgency about what is at stake here. Madam Speaker, you and your majority may decide today, but I have faith that the American people will decide otherwise next November. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Delbeni.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today in support of this resolution. After carefully reviewing all of the evidence and the articles of impeachment before us, it is clear that President Trump abused the power of the presidency and obstructed Congress. I did not come to this conclusion lightly. Impeachment is an extremely serious matter, but no president can be allowed to pressure a foreign country for personal and political gain. No president is above the law. His behavior has jeopardized the integrity of our elections, put our national security at risk, and placed his personal interests above those of the American people. His obstruction has prevented the House from conducting its constitutional duty of oversight of the executive branch. By failing to uphold his oath of office, President Trump forces each of us, as members of the House of Representatives, to uphold ours. I urge my colleagues to do just that and defend our democracy. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Rickleman.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I oppose this impeachment effort and will vote no on the articles of impeachment. I represent the 5th District of Virginia, which is home to so many founding fathers whose visions shaped the great country we are living in today. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are not around to see what their creation has become, but I don't think they would be pleased to see Congress subverting the will of democracy by holding an impeachment vote because the majority party simply cannot accept the 2016 election. Instead of wasting the taxpayers' time and money on specious investigations, we could have passed legislation to address surprise medical billing, secure the border, address the opioid epidemic, reduce student debt, and solve a litany of other issues that Americans actually care about. Tomorrow, we might have a vote on the USMCA, which we should have passed months ago had it not been for the obstruction and delays from Democrats, delays that have made farmers in my district and other districts suffer. Votes like the one we will take today, the decisions that have led up to today's vote, the nature and entire process of this proceeding reeks of careerist bureaucrats and politicians that put politics over people. I was not elected to take political votes that attempt to overturn the will of the American people. I ran for office to serve my constituents. Let's remember, that's why we are here. Weaponizing emotion is not the way to serve the United States of America. And to my colleagues who do just that, I offer a quote Thomas Paine wrote in The Crisis. To argue with a person who has renounced the use of reason is like administering medicine to the dead. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that the House has passed over 400 bills, 275 bipartisan bills, driving down costs of health care and prescription drugs, raising wages, rebuilding infrastructure, taking on corruption and self-dealing in Washington. 80% of these bills are languishing on Senator McConnell's desk. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I thank the chairman for yielding. I wish to place on the record that members of Congress swear a solemn oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and today we fulfill our oath by defending liberty. The central figure testing America's resolve is not here in Washington today. Rather, the closeted villain sits in Moscow at the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin has coordinated murders, election hacking, propaganda, the entrapment of willing fools and greedy underlings who put their own selfish interests over liberty. Putin seeks to sow disarray and destabilize democracies and the NATO alliance. At Putin's direction, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine in 2014, and as Ukraine defends Europe's eastern flank, 14,000 people have been killed at Putin's hand, with over 2 million displaced. Rather than stand up to Putin, President Trump and his minions aided Putin, first in hastening Russian interference in our 2016 elections, and then more recently withholding vital military aid from Ukraine to coerce its interference in our 2020 elections for Mr. Trump's personal gain.
Gentlelady's time's expired.
Might I end by saying, onward liberty, vote for the articles of impeachment.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Madam Speaker, I rise in
Gentleman's
opposition
recognized.
to these baseless articles of impeachment and the unprecedented process that's been used in this effort to impeach the duly elected President of the United States. It is a mockery of American justice. In 1788, one of our founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, wrote in the Federalist Papers, "In many cases, impeachment will connect itself with the pre-existing factions. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparable strength of parties, majority and minority, than by real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." What does this mean? It means that the majority can exert its influence regardless of justice. In this statement, Hamilton warned us about the danger of mob rule. Democrats have a criminal and have been searching for a crime for 3 years. But this president has not committed a crime. As the leader of American foreign policy, the president has a constitutional obligation to root out corruption in countries to which we provide aid. This is not an abuse of power. It is his job. One of the articles is obstruction of Congress. The only thing that's been obstructed is this president's right to due process. I don't blame the president for refusing to fully participate in this guilty until proven innocent circus. This is not how our founding fathers framed American justice. This is a tragic day in our nation's history. We have individuals that hate this president more than they love this country. Our country needs prayer and not this destructive partisanship. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, the president's obstruction is unprecedented and categorical. President Trump claims that the House cannot investigate his misconduct outside of an impeachment inquiry. He defies lawful congressional subpoenas and then he sues to block third parties from complying with such subpoenas. Even as he pursues his own interests in court, his administration simultaneously argues that Congress is barred from obtaining judicial enforcement when executive branch officials disregarded subpoenas. So when can the president be held accountable for his wrongdoing? In his mind, never. The Constitution, however, disagrees. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, my words are my only remedy today. In spite of the upcoming D.C. statehood vote, we expect to be successful. The people of the District of Columbia have no vote on impeachment or on any other matter on this floor now. I spoke on this floor on the impeachment of President Clinton 20 years ago. Unlike the Clinton impeachment on perjury concerning an affair with an intern, Trump's impeachment turns on sabotage of national security to get himself reelected. Clinton repented. Trump insists that he did nothing wrong. That's a promise to continue his long pattern of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. Impeachment is our only recourse. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Buck.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman from Georgia. Today, Democrats lower the bar for impeachment. Under this standard, a president can be impeached in the absence of a crime, without due process, and for asserting a legally, constitutionally recognized privilege. History shows Democrat presidents have abused power to undermine democracy and win elections, and yet they have not been impeached. President Franklin Roosevelt used the IRS to target his political opponents. His son later admitted FDR used, quote, the IRS as a weapon of political retribution. President John F. Kennedy used the FBI to wiretap and monitor political opponents, including congressional staff. He deported one of his mistresses to avoid scandal. President Lyndon Johnson spied on Goldwater's campaign, signing off on wiretapping his opponent and Goldwater's airplane and using a CIA spy to obtain advanced copies of Goldwater's strategies and speeches. President Barack Obama refused to provide documents to Congress related to Fast and Furious. His unconstitutional recess appointments were unanimously struck down by the Supreme Court. He used national security agencies to lie to the American people about Benghazi to win the 2012 election. He spied on reporters. Finally, it was the Obama administration that committed 17 serious violations before the FISA court to spy on Trump campaign associates. Despite these clear abuses of power by FDR, JFK, LBJ, and Obama, Republicans did not impeach. Why? Because the framers did not want a low bar for impeachment. They wanted Congress and the president to work out their differences. When I asked Professor Turley in a Judiciary Committee hearing if any president could avoid impeachment with this low standard, he said no. I yield back.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I would remind the gentleman that President Obama provided thousands of pages of information to congressional requests that Attorney General Holder and others testified, unlike now. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, today is a solemn day in America, a day that none of us hoped for when we came to Congress. But the events of today are something that each of us swore that we were prepared to execute in defense of the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This is the oath that binds the men and women of the 116th Congress. As our democracy implores, we defend her. A clear and present threat to American democracy is what brings us here. The architect, a president who asked that a foreign nation interfere in our election. This was our founding fathers' greatest fear. I cast this solemn vote for the many individuals in my district who entrusted me to be their voice in Congress. They entrusted me to uphold our Constitution for them. I vote yes for Sarah in Chicago, Doug in Kankakee, Diane in Flossmoor. Yes for Kathy in Momence, Catherine in Crete, and Jimmy in Park Forest. The facts are simple. The path forward is clear. Impeachment is not an option. It is an obligation because no one is above the law. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it is my privilege to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, another member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Reschenthaler.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Ranking Member Collins. You know, in the Navy, we had a saying, bluff, bottom line up front. Well, I'll give you the bottom line. Democrats are terrified that President Trump is going to win re-election. They can't beat him on the merits. So the Democrats are caving to their far-left radical base, and they're using the thoughts and the feelings and the assumptions of some unnamed bureaucrats rather than relying on facts and law to impeach a duly elected president. Let me be clear. This is nothing more than a political hit job. You know, I've been on all sides of the courtroom. I was a prosecutor in the Navy. I was a defense attorney in the Navy. I was a district judge in my hometown. And let me tell you, as a lawyer, I would defend this case every day of the week. As a judge, I would dismiss this on day one for lack of merit. There's no prima facie case here. I'll tell you who I'd prosecute, though. I would prosecute Adam Schiff for abuse of power. Why? How about the fact that he used his position as chairman to leak phone records of ranking member Devin Nunes? How about the fact that he dumped over 8,000 pages of documents on Republicans less than 48 hours before a hearing? That is the abuse of power. And obstruction? I prosecute the Democrats for obstruction. How about the fact that Judiciary Democrats voted down my request to subpoena the whistleblower? How about the fact that Chairman Nadler refused every single Republican request for a fact witness? That is obstruction of Congress. So again, let me be clear. Today is nothing more than a political hit job. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, once again, I hear a lot of attacks on Democratic members of Congress, but not one single word of substantive defense of the President's conduct. I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, each of us here took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, not the President and not our political party. Today, history will judge. Did we abide that oath? To extort a foreign country, to investigate your political opponent is an unconstitutional abuse of power. To solicit foreign interference in an American election is an unconstitutional abuse of power. The need to protect against just such abuses prompted our founders to grant the sole power of impeachment to this House. The delicate balance of power that underpins our democracy is threatened when a president disregards the Constitution by obstructing Congress's power to cover up illegal behavior. In doing that, President Trump violated his oath. Today, we must put country over party, conscience over complicity. Today, we must assert no one's above the law. Today, we're summoned by history to do the right thing. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I know this is probably not true, but I think the speakers are not working on the majority side because I have talked about it. Many of our members have talked about the facts. Let's just go over them real quickly. No pressure, no conditionality, nothing was ever denied them when they got through. They actually got the money and they never did anything for it. We have talked about the facts. That's a distraction that doesn't need to happen. With that, Madam Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I've heard numerous colleagues say they didn't run for Congress to impeach the president. Well, maybe not originally, but unfortunately from the moment proceedings began, after the 4th vote to launch an impeachment inquiry, today's vote was inevitable. Many of them campaigned on it. I love this country with a soldier's passion. I came here to defend freedom, not to deny due process to anyone. I came here to solve problems and change the broken status quo, not to distract or disrupt those like President Donald Trump who deliver on promises to put America back on the path of peace and prosperity that has made and kept our country free. For months now, Americans have heard speculation about the president's motives in Ukraine. Despite months of effort, dozens of hearings, and countless documents, Americans have not seen proof that the president committed a high crime or a misdemeanor. We have a republic if we can keep it. This is disgraceful, dishonest process. It's a discredit to this body and to our nation. I urge the House to drop these divisive articles of impeachment and get to work for the American people. I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, how much time, would you tell me how much time both sides have left, please?
Gentleman from New York has 2 hours and 2 minutes. Gentleman from Georgia has 2 hours and 3 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the facts are clear. The President of the United States withheld $400 million in military aid to an ally of the United States and also held back a White House meeting to compel a foreign nation to investigate his political opponent. At the exact time the President was doing this, Ukraine was engaged in a battle for its very existence with one of America's adversaries, Russia. The president abused his power to persuade a foreign nation to dig up dirt on a political opponent, and that's the truth. This was quite simply a geopolitical shakedown. The president then tried to block Congress from exercising its constitutionally mandated duty to uncover the truth. Every single one of us today faces a stark choice. If we choose to turn a blind eye to put political expediency before the Constitution, then we are complicit in this subversion of democracy. If we do not hold this president accountable, we have failed the people who sent us here, and we have abdicated our own oath to defend the Constitution. In the United States of America, no one is above the law, not even the president.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, it is my pleasure to yield 2 minutes from the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Byrne.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, in 3 months, we've gone from receiving an unsubstantiated, hearsay, and discredited whistleblower complaint to the production of articles of impeachment against the President of the United States. Not since Andrew Johnson has the House engaged in such a partisan political stunt. From the beginning, this has been a sham, and this House has been nothing but a star chamber. The Democrat majority literally locked themselves in the basement of this building, hiding from the American people. When my colleagues and I refused to stand for it, Democrats moved to public hearings, but denied us questions, denied us witnesses, and denied the president any meaningful opportunity to defend himself. With this complete abusive process, the Democratic majority has produced the flimsiest and most legally unsound articles of impeachment in the history of this nation. Never before has the House reported an article of impeachment that does not allege an underlying crime, yet this majority will do so today. Read the transcripts. There was no quid pro quo, no bribery, no extortion, no crime, and no abuse of power, and they don't even allege a crime in their articles of impeachment. The president raising Ukrainian corruption is not an impeachable offense. If the dealings of Hunter Biden were so above board, you would think the majority would be just fine looking into this matter. Yet they haven't moved my resolution asking for an investigation, and our subpoenas for Hunter Biden have all been denied. Hunter Biden doesn't get a pass because his dad was vice president. I am proud to have fought against this charade every step of the way, and I will proudly vote no today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the facts are uncontestable. The evidence is overwhelming. The president grossly misused the office of president and obstructed Congress, and justice requires this impeachment. I feel compelled to respond to the false narrative that Democrats are using this process to overturn an election. You know, I agree. Elections are the appropriate venue for public policy disputes. However, we're not talking about a public policy dispute. We're talking about a president who subverted national security by soliciting foreign interference in our elections, the exact thing our founding fathers feared, and the exact circumstance for which they drafted the impeachment clause. Our democracy, our Constitution deserves standing up for, not Donald John Trump. And I will leave my colleagues with this last thought as they decide how to cast this historic vote. For what shall it profit a man to gain the whole world only to lose his own soul? I yield back.
Lady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Goodman.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. This is the day the founding fathers feared, when they granted Congress the power of impeachment, where we have a political party so dead set against the president that they will do anything to impeach him. And they're about to get away with it simply because they have the votes. But that's not how this process is supposed to work. It's not meant to be dictated by a thin partisan majority, nor is it meant to be used when an election is just around the corner. And no one understands that better than our Speaker, who I have great respect for, and I agree with the comments she made on March the 6th of just this year. Impeachment is so divisive to the country that unless there's something so compelling and overwhelming and bipartisan, I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the nation. And that's exactly what's happened. And when we walk out of here tonight, we all know how this result's going to go. The Democrats are voting for this. Not one Republican is breaking. This is not bipartisan. The American people are disgusted with the United States House of Representatives, and we bring shame upon this body today by moving forward this impeachment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lowenthal.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The facts in this case are as simple as they are tragic. Witness after witness attested to these facts. No one has credibly refuted them. President Trump tried to coerce Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 elections. He used the power of his office for personal political gain. By withholding aid to Ukraine, the president has endangered our ally Ukraine and undermined our own national security. And when he got caught, the president attempted to cover up the crime and shut down any investigation by obstructing Congress. We have overwhelming evidence that this president poses an urgent threat to our elections, to our national security, and to the rule of law. Congress must vote to impeach him to protect our constitutional republic. There is no alternative. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The only urgent threat to this body is the clock in the calendar and the desire to impeach the president before we go home for Christmas. With that, 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rowe.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today's a sad day in the people's house. Since Donald Trump was elected in 2016, Democrats have been on a crusade to stop him by any means. I believe the American people are the fairest people on this earth. They believe that everyone should be treated equally under the law, no matter what your station you occupy in life. Rich, poor, president, factory worker, fair. This process has been anything but fair. For 2 years, we've been told that then candidate Donald Trump colluded with Russians to interfere with our elections. 2 years, millions of dollars spent on the Mueller investigation. No collusion. You'd think after being that wrong, Democrats would finally decide to work on the problems that the American people sent us here to do. You'd be wrong again. Then we were told that the president withheld money to the Ukrainians in a quid pro quo. No, a bribery, no, abuse of power. I guess whatever polls best to gather information on a political rival, potential rival. Well, here are some facts about what happened. Fact number one, the transcript of July 25th phone conversation that President released shows no pressure. Fact number two, President Zelensky did not know the money was withheld. Fact number three, no investigation occurred or was announced. Fact number four, the money was released September 11th, 2019. Facts are stubborn things. One member on the other side of the aisle said, quotes, "I'm concerned that if we don't impeach this president, he will get reelected," end quotes. That, Madam Speaker, says it all. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Gentlelady's recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I take seriously my oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, and I do not take today's proceedings lightly. The Founding Fathers included the impeachment process in the Constitution to uphold our values and to maintain the checks and balances that are essential to separation of powers and to democracy. They knew way back in 1787 that a president could abuse the power of the office. In fact, they adopted the phrase high crimes and misdemeanors from a phrase that had been used in the English Parliament since 1386, intended to cover situations where an official abused his power and included in disobeying an order from the Parliament. Donald Trump has abused the power of his office by inviting a foreign government to interfere in the U.S. election. And he did this not to help the United States, but to benefit himself. That's wrong, and it's an impeachable offense. And then when Congress exercised our constitutional duty to investigate these wrongdoings, he obstructed the investigation every step of the way. That is also wrong, and it's also an impeachable offense. In our country, no one is above the law. That includes the President of the United States. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this point, I yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the gentleman. You know, December is such a great month, and there's so many great dates in December, and we talk about the wonderful things that have happened in Decembers of the past. There's also, in addition to Christmas being something we celebrate, the Boston Tea Party took place in December, but also on December 7th, 1941, a horrific act happened in the United States, and it's one that President Roosevelt said, this is a date that will live in infamy. Today, December the 18th, 2019, is another date that will live in infamy. When just because you hate the President of the United States and you can find no other reason other than the fact that you're so blinded by your hate that you can't see straight, that you've decided the only way we can make sure this president doesn't get elected again is to impeach him. On the floor of the People's House, the bastion of democracy and liberty in the whole world, we have decided that political power is far more important than principle. I would urge all members of the House to vote no on impeachment and to look their voters in the eye and remember, listen, let me tell you, the voters will remember next November what you're doing this December. This is a terrible time. This is a date that will live in infamy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentlemen, the members are reminded to address their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
In 1787, at the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "Do we have a republic or a monarchy?" He responded, "A republic if you keep it." Madam Speaker, a republic is a form of government in which the country is considered a public matter, not the private concern or property of the rulers. In a republic, no person is above the law. In a republic, the president may not abuse his power by withholding critical foreign assistance for his own personal political gain, nor may he stop witnesses from talking. I did not come to Congress to impeach a president, but I did take an oath to keep the republic. For our children and our grandchildren, we should do nothing less. One day, I will tell my grandson that I stood up for our democracy. I will vote yes to impeach the president. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield a minute 40 seconds to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and 40 seconds.
Thank you. I'd like to address why we're here. We're certainly not here because of a misquoted phone call in July of 2019. The Washington Post ran an article headlined, "The campaign to impeach President Trump has begun the day he was sworn in." The gentleman from Maryland who spoke earlier today called for impeachment 2 days before President Trump was before he was sworn in. The gentleman from Texas was introducing impeachment resolutions 2 years ago and said President Trump should be impeached so he can't get reelected. This impeachment is not about anything that happened on a phone call. This impeachment is about what President Trump has done. The people in this country who are let in, who are inadmissible or apprehended and don't have legal authority, fell from 100,000 people in May to under 5,000 people in November, and you hate him for it. Ben Carson thinks that low-income housing should be used by American citizens and not people who are here illegally, and you hate him for it. President Trump doesn't want people coming here and going on welfare, and you hate him for it. President Trump wants able-bodied people on food stamps to try to work, and he's hated for it. President Trump renegotiated that rip-off trade agreement with Mexico and Canada, and that was let in place by President Bush and President Obama, and you hate him for it. President Trump sides with law enforcement instead of criminals, and murders dropped 1,000 people last year, and you hate him for siding with the police. President Trump lets Christian adoption agencies choose who they want to be parents, and you don't like him for that. President Trump won't let foreign aid go to agencies that perform abortions. You hate him for that. President Trump's judges stick to the Constitution. He's disliked for that. President Trump is keeping his campaign promises, and you hate him for that. I yield the remainder of my time.
Members are once again reminded to keep their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, we do not hate President Trump, but we do know that President Trump will continue to threaten the nation's security, democracy, and constitutional system if he is allowed to remain in office. That threat is not hypothetical. President Trump has persisted during this impeachment inquiry in soliciting foreign powers to investigate his political opponent. The president steadfastly insists that he did nothing wrong and is free to do it all again. That threatens our next election, as well as our constitutional democracy. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the House of Representatives, the People's House, is vested by the Constitution with the power of impeachment to balance the power of the presidency. Without this essential duty, the president could exploit his sacred office without any regard for the law. On January 3rd, 2019, every member of the House swore an oath to defend the Constitution, and this week we're being asked to do just that. When allegations arose that the president tried to coerce a foreign government to help undermine the 2020 election, the House carried out its duty to investigate a potential abuse of power. But the president refused to cooperate and forbade his administration from doing so, obstructing Congress from carrying out our sworn responsibility. If these actions bear no consequence, future presidents may act without constraint, and American democracy will be at an end. Therefore, compelled by my sworn duty to defend the Constitution, I will vote to impeach this president. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield to my friend from Florida 1.5 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to address my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and reiterate President Washington's warning to the Republic 223 years ago. The Constitution rightly sets a high bar for impeachment, but the integrity of the process also depends on the ability of the legislators to vote their minds independent of party politics. Removing a president is too important, and lawmakers are given too much latitude to define high crimes and misdemeanors for it to be any other way. Otherwise, excessively partisan politicians could overturn an election simply because the president is a member of the opposite and opposing party. It is in regard to this impeachment process that George Washington forewarned us as a nation at this moment in history. When political parties may now and then answer popular ends, they are likely in the course of time and things to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men and women will be enabled to subvert the power of the people to usurp for themselves the reins of government. How wise he was. Vote no on this assault to our republic, the Constitution, and against President Trump.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Madam Speaker, John Adams warned in a letter to Thomas Jefferson that these risks are unavoidable and might sometimes overlap. Quote, "You are apprehensive of foreign interference, intrigue, influence. So am I. As often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs." Close quote. I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, today history is being written. The facts are conclusive. The president attempted to use the power of the powerful office of president to force Ukraine to influence our 2020 election. In the process, President Trump jeopardized our national security and withheld vital military assistance intended to prevent further Russian aggression to our region. However, as our committees, including government oversight, which I sit on, and which I'm a member, sought to interview additional witnesses and obtain documents, the president ordered from the power of his office that the executive branch to not participate and obstructed the congressional oversight. Article 1 provides the House of Representatives with the sole power of impeachment, as well as the authority to conduct oversight of the executive branch. What did he have to hide? When the framers met over 200 years ago, they went to great lengths to ensure future presidents would be forced to answer to their constitutional responsibility. I stand today in support of the 2 articles of impeachment.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today is a sad day for this body, for the voters who sent me here last November, and for our nation. Benjamin Franklin cautioned when asked what he had given us, a republic if you can keep it. Today we take a step further toward losing the republic that our founding fathers envisioned by engaging in activity that they specifically warned against, the misuse of the constitutional power of impeachment for one party's political gain. Our Constitution is the very foundation of our republic. Its assurance of self-determination has been the shining beacon by which our nation has chartered its course over the last 2 centuries. From a new democratic experiment struggling to survive to the greatest nation on earth, America has been powered over the years not by government, but by the ingenuity, the bravery, and the faith of its people.